I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Welcome to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. Today, I'm talking with Renad Mansour and Hayder Al-Shakeri from Chatham House about their research into conflict economies and conflict supply chains in territories formerly held by ISIS, some of the remote border regions of Iraq, and their kind of path-breaking look at how these areas work. And we're going to get into that in a second. Welcome to the podcast, Renad and Hayder.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into this kind of Wild West story you two have documented of smuggling across the Iraqi border, start by telling us what was the research question in the project that led you to be looking at this type of conflict supply chain or conflict economy in the first place?
Well, in the geography that we were looking at, parts of Iraq and Syria, ISIS has lost its territorial control for several years. And you don't have that conflict that you had, before. But we wanted to know, what does it look like there now? Is it completely stabilized? Are people no longer living in conflict because ISIS is gone? Or what is the reality? And the way we wanted to do that was to look at some of these supply chains, these conflict economies that connect, the borders of Iraq and Syria and Jordan and these areas that ISIS, emerged from because of the way they were able to take control of these supply chains.
And let me just stop you to elaborate on that a little bit, because typically the things we read and see look at these kinds of questions through a security lens, right? Places where ISIS rose and took control and then receded. We see studies of militias or how many men have weapons, or the sort of infrastructures of violence. So why explain this different approach you're taking?
Well, because, the violence, has been done and it's clear. The ideology has been done and it's clear. But what really distinguished ISIS beyond those two was how wealthy it was able to become, right? It became the world's, it was known as the world's richest terrorist, Salafi jihadist terrorist organization at its peak, making millions and millions each month. And that really helped it accelerate to take over a third of Iraq and so much of Syria. And so understanding these supply chains, which existed before and after ISIS, really gives us a glimpse into both ISIS, but also conflict in that area.
So when you say supply chains, what I hear is how people make money, basically trade, finance, smuggling, the way people acquire goods, the way people make money, and what I hear you saying is that ISIS was uniquely successful at finding ways to make money when it took territorial control of places. And so you want to find out what happened to all those economic sort of web, that economic web after the fall of ISIS in 2018.
These are historic trading routes that go way back to even before these countries existed, and there was a moment where ISIS was controlling it, but removing ISIS doesn't mean these routes and this trade and the pursuit of profit by different armed groups, political actors, and others has stopped, right? And so we wanted to know in these areas, the supply of everything from illicit narcotics, but also to like licit goods like agriculture, tomatoes, sheep, animals, food. Who is profiting from that right now? And what does that tell us about, the stability of that region?
Okay, so how, and maybe Hayder, you want to address this, how did you go about looking for a case study or for a story to tell that helps us shed light on this question of how the rise and fall of ISIS has affected the ways in which people live and acquire goods and make money?
So basically we went to Anbar and we started talking with people to see how did this supply chain affected them, what are they doing right now. what are the harms that are being infected upon them because of these supply chains. And what we found out that because of the changing in the supply chain and because of restricting certain borders, opening other borders, changing in the actors and in the people who are managing and controlling things, there are many harms that were inflicted on people residing in different parts, especially in border areas that are bordering Syria and Jordan.
And I assume this is hard work to do because Anbar province, for those of our listeners who aren't deeply familiar with Iraq's geography, is the vast desert province that stretches from the western edge of Baghdad all the way to the borders with Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria in the west. It's an enormous expanse. There's a couple of key cities along the way, and a lot of it is hard to control, open, rolling desert lands. And as Renad mentioned a few minutes ago, this is also an area of the world that has millennial trading routes, overland trading routes that have been around since I think maybe before recorded history, certainly as long as we've had recorded history. So this is a really rich backdrop against which to do some research in the relatively short 5 or 10 year historical period of ISIS and post-ISIS smuggling and trading. So let's go into the actual story you uncovered, which is kind of a rollicking narrative, the rise and fall of a couple of competing border towns and smuggling points. Do you want to just sort of lay set the scene for us with what's the story you uncovered about what happened in these border towns and border areas?
So in our research, we examined 2 border towns. One is Rutba, which is a district in Anbar that's bordering Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. We also looked at Al-Qaim, where there is a border town and a border crossing with Syria. And what we saw that despite Rutba being a vast, big area, having the 3 border crossings with 3 different countries, there are many restrictions that were there because of the security situation, because of ISIS, despite the fact that ISIS have left 6-7 years ago. While Al-Qaim has been having a thriving trade and a supply chain that is very open across the official border crossing, but also across many unofficial border crossings that some groups have opened throughout the years while they control these areas.
So let's tell the story in chronological order before we get into the sort of meta-analysis. So what happened to trade and movement at Rutba during the period of ISIS and after ISIS's defeat?
So maybe briefly I can just sketch that out. So during ISIS, ISIS controlled this territory, the border across from Iraq and Syria, obviously, but also much of this area in Anbar. When ISIS is territorially defeated, the Iraqi government.
Wait, we're not during this time that ISIS was in control. Was the border sealed? Were goods and people able to cross at those spots?
This was the Islamic State between Iraq and Syria.
Okay, between Iraq and Syria, Islamic State was on both sides, but on the Jordanian and Saudi side.
Well, this is the story.
Okay.
So the Jordanians, and this was the border crossing before ISIS between Iraq and Jordan. These networks were created during the 1990s, even with Saddam Hussein looking to skirt sanctions. So what happens when ISIS emerges is much of the activity moves towards Iraq and Syria, which is the Islamic State. And at the same time, Jordan closes and increases restrictions on the Iraq-Jordan border, right? So once ISIS is defeated, those groups that defeated ISIS, working with the Iraqi government, take over these routes across Iraq and Syria. So what we're talking about here is a decision to close one border point, that is the border between Iraq and Jordan, and also a reality of an emerging border point that is between Iraq and Syria that sees the supply chain move from Iraq, Jordan towards Iraq and Syria in the context of a post-ISIS region. And
in order to get like a sort of feel for what that means, so I mean, my understanding from all the time I've spent in Iraq is that a huge amount of basic goods come to Iraq overland from Jordan, right? From medicine and food to all kinds of consumer goods.
This was the crossing for many, many years.
So up and I mean, during some of the most violent parts of the sectarian civil war, when Anbar was incredibly dangerous in the 2000s, there was still a huge amount of car and truck traffic overland through this border point. So if you're telling me that completely got shut off during the period when ISIS was in control of Anbar province. And then you're telling me that once ISIS was defeated, the different groups in control of that physical area basically kept it limited. So they didn't reopen it fully 24 hours a day, lines of trucks like we used to have historically, but they reopened it as a very securitized and heavily monitored area in which the first priority is preventing the return of ISIS rather than the free flow of goods and people across the border. What does that do to the kinds of you're going to tell me in a minute about the shift to Qaim, but the first thing I want to know is, did Iraqis just have to go without all the licit, regular goods that they had depended on from the sanctions period onward through this crossing?
So basically, the supply chain kind of shifted. So when we talk to the people from Rutba, from Tribir, that borderland between Iraq and Jordan, they said that, things are not passing through Jordan anymore. Before, thousands of trucks used to pass daily, and now maybe 100 or even less pass a day because of, they open 4 or 5 hours a day, those borders, and they have very strict restrictions on these points. So people are preferring to go through Basra to the ports, through Al-Qaim, through Syria, or they import things through Iran, through Iraq's eastern borders, and that's why people have had restrictions on Rutba, where illicit goods have made it less and less in these areas, and people in that area have stopped working basically because they used to rely on that route. Trucks used to pass, goods used to pass, and they used to gain their livelihoods from these trucks and this route.
So maybe if I can add to that, so what we're talking about here is a restricted sort of path, a restricted route, which means that medical supplies, food, daily essentials are no longer being, are no longer coming to many of these peoples who live on that route, right? These are people that used to live on a huge, prosperous trading route, and they've been shut off. We did focus groups with the residents in these communities to really understand what they're going through, and some of the things that we heard was just tragic. You have women who don't have access to hospitals. You have women who said, going through being pregnant and delivering a baby, sometimes by the time the ambulance comes or by the time you try and get to a hospital, they've already delivered the baby. You have children who aren't getting the medicine they need on time. All of this in the name of restricting a border to make this area, more secure. And the focus groups and what people from these areas were saying is that their lives have become dire because of this. And so, if we kind of zoom out and look at the story of Iraq and the story of Anbar, it's when this happens and where this escalates that conflict reemerges.
Okay, we'll be right back after a short break. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You're listening to Order from Ashes, Century International's podcast, and we're talking to Renad Mansour and Hayder Al-Shakeri from Chatham House about their research into illicit conflict supply chain, not illicit, but just conflict supply chains in Iraq. We'll be right back.
Today's world is changing faster than ever. Old rules don't apply and the new rules haven't been written. At least not yet. I'm Rohan Advani and I produce the Order from Ashes podcast at the Century Foundation, a leading progressive think tank that promotes peace, cooperation, and equality at home and abroad. On Order from Ashes, we try to make sense of a new international system in which America no longer dictates the global order. Join us as we talk to activists and analysts on the front lines of the most pressing issues in international policy.
Welcome back. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. I'm talking with Hayder Al-Shakeri and Renad Mansour from Chatham House about their research into conflict supply chains in Iraq. It's great to have you two on the podcast. And right before the break, Renad, you were talking about the sort of tragic human impact of what happens when, for security reasons, a crucial border transshipment point is shut down or limited. And you were starting to sort of weave a picture of the ripples of human impact. And the last thing you said, and this is what I want you to pick up, is you said that in this, as I heard it, in this effort to police and secure this sensitive trade area, a sort of, in a sense, a heavily securitized approach to this border area can ultimately not only make people suffer, but create new vectors of conflict. If I understood you correctly, explain how that works. How this effort to button things down and make things safer can paradoxically create new avenues for violent armed conflict.
So these armed groups and politicians and businessmen, these networks who were meant to be the target of closing this border, have shifted to another border point, kilometers away. So they're still profiting and the trade continues. But what's missing from the story is the implications on people who are now living in this sort of closed, isolated, excluded area. And as I said, in the last 20 years of Iraq, it's when this type of exclusion, when people don't have their basic needs met, when life becomes so difficult that it becomes unbearable, that kind of exclusion is conflict. And so this is why we're talking about supply chains and looking at supply chains to understand how harm and conflict could potentially escalate. If you talk about Anbar has historically, for the last 20 years, been the sort of the region where terrorism and Salafi jihadist groups have long had a presence, right? Now, since the defeat of ISIS, Anbar has been celebrated as a success story. If you look at the big cities of Anbar, the ones that we became familiar with being dangerous, like Fallujah, like Ramadi, that's right. There has been attention paid on these cities to make sure that they are rebuilding and reconstruction so that ISIS never comes back. But you zoom into the border points and you zoom into some of these towns and cities along the border that we're talking about with Jordan that have been shut off, and you begin to hear that the dire sort of exclusion that is causing communities to suffer.
Is it driving any kind of resurgence of armed activity or militant activity or even, recruitment to Takfiri groups like ISIS itself or its successors?
I mean, what we're seeing, and Hayder sort of has been looking into this, but what we're seeing is actually the securitization of the border has led to actually a proliferation of illicit armed groups, more criminality at the moment than sort of ISIS type. But you're having the trade of Captagon and all sorts of illicit goods coming in and out, and that's bringing their own sets of criminal networks in those areas right now.
So you've done this work, I think, as part of a grant from the UK government that's interested in understanding how these illicit economies work, and it seems like you're arguing that closing the official border or limiting the official border is essentially making things worse in the like black market and illicit crossings further afield. Is that right?
Yes, exactly, and this is what has been happening in Rutba, but also in Qaim, where we also looked at the border there and how the opening of the border increasingly in Al-Qaim has caused the militarization of the area because more of the armed groups have started moving there. More of these armed groups have started taking land, making them their headquarters, and starting training, storing weapons and ammunition. We've seen recently some of these depots have exploded in residential areas. We've seen bombardment by the U.S. on these areas. We've seen people not being able to go back to their farms and agricultural lands in Al-Qaim, where the Euphrates come. And this has affected the residents of these areas. And we've also been seeing an increased illicit drugs coming into Al-Qaim and throughout the rest of Iraq and to other countries.
I want to slow you down and get you to unpack this explanation, because I find it confusing and potentially not persuasive, unless you can give me some better like granular detail that makes this make more sense to me. Because these militias, for their own reasons, want to be present in these areas. These are Shia militias that do not have a local constituency. They want to be here for both security and self-enrichment reasons. That would be the case whether or not official border crossings are open. And although it's interesting to talk about weapons and drug trafficking, those are illicit goods that are always trafficked at unofficial points. So the sort of nugget of an argument that says this change in the official organization of the border is causing these unintended consequences would have to rest with some kind of description of a shift in what happens to the trading of legal goods, food, vegetables, medicine, now that there's this limit in the official crossing. So can you, have you found that kind of trade has shifted from taking place in the official border crossing to being run by distressing militias who are using the unofficial crossing point at Qaim to do that trade?
Yes, for sure. Once the restrictions on Rutba and Tribil started, and merchants and businessmen found that they can't access licit goods easily, whether it's vegetables, whether it's supplies, whether it's whatever. They started going other places, and one of these places is through Al-Qaim, but also through Basra, through the eastern borders, and even through Turkey. So the illicit goods kept on coming into Iraq, but through those groups themselves. So those groups are controlling also the illicit trade.
Tell us why this is a problem. I have my own suspicions and ideas about this, but you all have done a lot of really good, thorough work, granular work in the field here. Why is this a problem, and what, if anything, can anyone do about it?
So the argument that we're making isn't that putting closing a border as such or trying to add security to an area as such is necessarily a problem. Sorry. The argument that we're making is only closing a border without taking into account the wider ripple effects of the people living and the people who are affected by that decision to close a border will lead to different types of conflict. Now, we're not saying that ISIS is returning anytime soon, but what we're saying is that people, conflict isn't just addressed through militarization or through this type of securitization. There are communities that need support, and so looking at it as a supply chain but allows you to look at the wider impact and the wider dynamics of people, of geographies, and of goods being traded. So people living in Rutba today are living in conflict. even though it might not appear to be that way because the border is so securitized from the outside. But going there, speaking to residents, allows you to really feel that sense of disillusionment and just the inability to live a decent standard of life. So that's the argument that we're making, not to sort of address, not to just close borders, but have a more coherent policy, right? So this project, it's part of it's this cross-border conflict project. It's an evidence policy and trends research program funded by UK aid from the UK government. Its purpose, what we're trying to do, is to give policymakers a better understanding of, okay, you see a problem, you want to shut down a border to stop something? What are the potential ripple effects across borders of conflict, and what can be done to better address the bigger sort of picture?
Yeah, I see two very concrete policy implications. I mean, there's more, but two leap to mind right away from this work. One is, the policymakers are interested in stopping the flow of jihadi fighters across the border, but instead of stopping that or just stopping that, they're stopping this whole other range of things that causes a lot of harm to the civilian population that policymakers are supposedly trying to help. The other thing I see is an affirmative policy interest in opening legal commercial border crossings to travelers and goods, because if you don't, you end up causing all kinds of harmful ripple effects. And when I hear you talking about what happened in Rutba and Qaim, I of course think about at a different border, but I think about how the border regimen in northwest Syria, between northwest Syria and Turkey, that was again a security decision, ended up causing huge amounts of human misery after the earthquake because this kind of unreasonably restrictive security regimen made it impossible for humanitarian aid and other goods to cross the border. So I see a pretty interesting and clear case from what you're making for what you're making here, and I wonder what does the Iraqi government think about this? Have they made a case or made an effort to fully reopen the Rutba border in order to basically reacquire for the legal pathway all this movement of people and goods that's moved into these illicit militia-controlled ports or border crossings?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it shows you how we're talking about a border, a very small local area, but it's connected to the Iraqi government just as much as it's connected to the Syrian government. And so the supply chain brings in all of these. And if you think about the Iraqi government, especially following the fight against ISIS, many of the groups, many of the politicians and the armed groups that are profiting from this modified supply chain, let's say, which is now going through Al-Qaim instead of Rutba, are also influencing the government. So there is the reason for this reality is because Iraq's elite today are profiting in this way. Many of these groups, share good connections. They have better connections to groups in Syria rather than groups in Jordan. So it makes sense for them to keep this up. There's an economic interest, which means there's an interest to become powerful by doing this. So, and at the same I was
going to say, for the corrupt factions, it seems like this bad setup, it's bad for people, is good for them, right? It makes it easier to steal and embezzle from trade.
Yeah. I mean, that's the point, right? So there's a new reality in post-ISIS Iraq in these areas where Syria and Iraq are now a prime area for profit by armed groups that share relations across these borders. At the same time, where the relationship with Jordan is a bit more problematic for many of these groups, and they don't share the same kind of connections and would not profit as much on that side.
I remember visiting this border crossing as a journalist in 2005 or 2006. I think it was 2005 in the fall, and I was in Syria. And at the time, there was a big there was a big issue about the flow of jihadi volunteers via Syria into Anbar to join Al-Qaeda and other groups fighting the Americans. And so the Syrian government put on a sort of demonstration, and they invited a bunch of foreign correspondents to see how they were going to seal up this border. It was a Potemkin initiative, and seeing how it worked really, for me, hit home how impossible it is to control these borders. So they brought us to the sort of bluff overlooking from the Abu Kamal side, overlooking Qaim, and they were rolling out concertina wire, and they had several hundred meters of concertina wire, and I walked to the end of it, and at the end of it there was just an open hilly area, and there were smugglers crossing the border openly right within sight of the Syrian army on one side and the U.S. Marines on the other, and none of these security institutions, whether they wanted to or not, could do a thing about it, because these smugglers had been doing this forever, and they were carrying everything people needed, and you can't tell the difference between a person who's carrying a farmer's crop versus someone who's maybe a future fighter in disguise. And what I took away from that was that unless you have an actually locally governed and legitimate entity in control of that area, and even then, you're probably never going to be able to control smuggling across this border.
Yeah, just one thing that the other day we were talking to an Iraqi official, and he mentioned a similar scenario where he said through the official border crossing, these groups, they bring in illicit and licit goods through official vehicles that are not being searched, that are not being through customs, because, these are official vehicles. But he said the biggest problem is through the unofficial crossings that are in the dozens across Iraq and Syria, where, they can't even control, and there's no way they can control unless, they look deeply into the issue and they look deeply into the aftermath of this.
Renad, you have a closing comment?
When the Ali Alawi, as finance minister a few years ago, found, he sort of went publicly and said that Iraq is losing billions each year at these border points, right? And we often think about these border points as being illegal, as being against, sort of in the shadows. Some people would say black market, informality. But what this tale of two border towns it also tells us is how intertwined this trade, although it's not on the formal books of the government, but how intertwined it is with the political elites and their armed groups and their businesses across these countries. And that's what makes it even more challenging, because it's not black and white. This is an economy that has been sustained for many years and will continue to be sustained. And so, international policymakers who are looking to support stabilization policies and development, should be looking at these border points as a wider supply chain that connects countries across some of these artificial borders that have been drawn, to better understand how a tiny border town or a small locality could impact not just that town, but over time, a much larger part of area and more people.
Yeah, I see this as a really useful mapping exercise in the fact that says, like, okay, if you're going to muck around, securitizing a border, closing a border, doing other things that might be legitimate ideas of how to prevent the return of ISIS, let's say, or restore governance, you need to know what you're doing and what effect you're having. And this story you tell, it has it's the real story of how people live, survive, trade, make money, earn livings, and end up sometimes engaging in conflict in an area that has a really rich and complicated bunch of people who have power, overlapping groups that have power in it. So I found this a really interesting conversation, a useful conversation, and I assume you have years to come of additional case studies and stories that you're going to unearth through this work that helps us understand the ways people live in these conflict areas and what are some of the unintended consequences of international and national policies in these areas. Thank you for coming on the podcast. We've been talking with Hayder Al-Shakeri, who is a research associate in the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, and Renad Mansour, who's the director of the Iraq initiative at Chatham House. They've been doing field work, a lot of field work in Iraq, and specifically today they were talking about their field work in Anbar province, looking at the changing patterns of trade and movement at different border crossings in Western Iraq. Thank you both for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
This is Order from Ashes, Century International's podcast. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. Thanks for joining and listening to us today. Until next time. The Order from Ashes podcast has been brought to you by Century International. Our work builds on more than 100 years of commitment to international peace, security, and governance at the Century Foundation. We are independent, critical, and progressive. For more information about Century International's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We depend on audience feedback to reach new listeners. If you like what you hear, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.